Some moments break you, not because of what happens, but because of what doesn't. 5 women stood in the dirt, outside a rancher's barn, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the ground. They waited for him to claim what every man before him had taken without asking. But Silas Corian just stepped back. He didn't reach for them, didn't speak the words they'd learned to dread. He simply said he had water and a place to rest. And that's when something inside them shattered, because in their world, kindness from a man had become the most impossible thing to believe in. The dawn had barely touched the horizon when Silas heard the noise in his barn. Not the familiar sounds of horses shifting in their stalls or barn cats hunting mice. This was different breathing, human breathing, shallow and controlled, like someone trying to disappear into silence. He'd been awake for an hour already, the way he always was before the sun rose, unable to shake the habit his years had carved into him. The ranch sat far from any settlement, surrounded by empty grassland that stretched until it met distant hills. Nobody came out. Here, nobody had reason to. That's why he'd chosen it. He pushed the barn door, opened slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness inside. The smell hit him first. Sweat, dirt, fear. Then he saw them. 5 women pressed against the far wall, clustered together like cornered animals. Their clothes were torn, faces strewn with grime and dried blood. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17, with delicate features barely visible under the dirt. The oldest may be close to 40, still carrying traces of the beauty that had likely made her a target. Their eyes tracked his every movement, wide and calculating, measuring the distance between them and the door, between them and him, between them and whatever came next. Silas stopped moving. He'd seen that look before in different places, different circumstances. It was the look of people who had forgotten what safety felt like. One of the women, dark-haired with a scar running along her jawline that somehow made her striking features more memorable, stepped slightly forward. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her chin lifted in a gesture that tried to be defiant, but couldn't quite hide the tremor in her shoulders. She was the leader, the protector, the one who'd take the first blow to buy the others seconds of time. He kept his voice low, non-threatening, told them his name was Silas, said they looked like they needed water and food. The dark-haired woman, Ruth, didn't answer. She just stared at him with eyes that had seen too much. Behind her, one of the younger women started crying silently, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on her cheeks. Another woman, older, pulled the crying girl closer, wrapping thin arms around her. Silas took a step back toward the door, told them he'd bring water and leave it outside. They could drink, they could rest, and when they were ready, they could tell him what they needed. Ruth's eyes narrowed. She'd heard promises from men before, pretty words that turned into something else once the door was closed. He could see her mind working, trying to figure out his angle, his price, what he'd demand in return, because in her experience, men always demanded something. He left the barn and walked back to the house, feeling their eyes burning into his back with every step. Inside, his hand shook slightly as he filled a pitcher with water from the well bucket. His helper, Toby, wouldn't arrive until midday. That meant hours alone with 5 terrified women who clearly expected the worst from him. He grabbed some bread and dried meat, wrapping it in cloth. When he returned to the barn, he set everything just inside the door and stepped back outside, told them through the wooden slats that it was there when they wanted it. No strings. Inside the barn, Ruth stood frozen, every muscle locked. The others looked to her, waiting for guidance, for permission to believe or to run. Clara, the youngest, whispered something about being so thirsty. Margaret, the older woman, tightened her grip protectively. Eliza, who hadn't spoken a word since they'd escaped, just stared at the door with empty eyes, and Sarah, barely more than a girl, had Stop crying. But her whole body shook. Ruth's mind raced through possibilities. This could be a trap. Men, out here this far from anywhere, they didn't just help women who showed up in their barns covered in the evidence of where they'd been. Men took what they wanted. That's what she'd learned over 6 years of captivity. That's what the others had learned, too. But something, in the way this man had stepped back, the way he'd kept his distance, the way his voice had stayed level and calm, it didn't fit the pattern, and that terrified her more than anything else. Because if she let herself hope, and she was wrong, the fall would destroy what little was left of them. But then Clara moved. The girl couldn't take it anymore. She stumbled toward the water pitcher, falling to her knees and drinking desperately. The others followed, unable to resist any longer. They drank like people who'd been walking through desert heat for days. Ruth stayed back, watching the door, waiting for it to burst open for Silas to return and show his true intentions now that they'd taken his offering. But nothing happened. Minutes passed. Then, an hour. The sun climbed higher, sending shafts of light through gaps in the barn walls, and still the door didn't open. Ruth's hands slowly unclenched. She didn't know what to do with this. Didn't know how to categorize a man who gave without taking. It went against everything she'd built her survival on. Outside, Silas sat on the porch of his small house, watching the barn from a distance. He wasn't sure what he'd stumbled into, but he knew enough to recognize broken people when he saw them. He'd been broken once too, still was in some ways. The scars just didn't show on the outside anymore. He thought about riding into the nearest settlement for help, but something told him these women had been running from people, not toward them. So he waited. Let them choose their next move. Let them breathe. What he didn't know was that 20 miles away, a group of men had discovered the women were missing, and those men were already tracking their trail across the grassland, following signs that led directly to his ranch. By midday, Toby arrived at the ranch on horseback, whistling a tune that died in his throat the moment he saw Silas sitting rigid on the porch. The older man's posture was all wrong. Too still, too focused on the bone. Silas had the kind of weathered, strong-featured face that spoke of hard years survived with eyes that carried weight most men never learn to shoulder. In 3 years of working this ranch, Toby had never seen him look like this. Worried, yes, tired often, but this was different. This was the look of a man standing between something fragile and something dangerous. Silas explained in low tones what he'd found that morning. 5 women, half dead from exhaustion and fear. Toby's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant out here. Knew what happened to women who fell into the wrong hands. Whether Apache raiders or white men who were no better. He asked what Silas planned to do. The answer was simple. Keep them safe. Feed them. Let them decide their next move. Toby nodded slowly, then asked the question that mattered. What happens when whoever took them comes? Looking? Inside the barn, Ruth had finally allowed herself to sit. Her legs wouldn't hold her upright anymore. The others had collapsed hours ago into exhausted sleep on the hay, their bodies surrendering to fatigue now that immediate danger seemed to have passed. But Ruth couldn't sleep, wouldn't? Someone had to stay alert. Someone had to watch for the moment when this man's patience ran out and his real intentions showed themselves. She'd seen it before. Men who played kind at first, lulling women into false security before the trap snapped shut. Clara stirred beside her, whimpering in her sleep. Ruth reached out instinctively, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder until she settled. The youngest had been taken only 8 months ago from a settlement raid. 8 months, and she was already broken in ways that might never heal. Ruth remembered her own first 8 months. Remembered thinking death would be easier. Remembered the moment she'd stopped thinking at all and just learned to survive, one breath at a time, one violation at a time, until she'd become something that could endure anything because she'd forgotten she was human. Margaret woke with a gasp, eyes wild, until she remembered where they were. She looked at Ruth with a question in her expression. How long until we run again? Ruth didn't have an answer. They'd fled the Apache camp 3 nights ago when the men were drunk and distracted. They'd walked through darkness, following stars, avoiding open ground, drinking from streams, eating nothing. Clara had wanted to stop at the first settlement they saw, but Ruth had pulled them past it. Settlements meant questions. Questions meant exposure, and exposure meant being sent back or being claimed by new masters. This ranch had seemed abandoned from a distance. That's why they'd approached. Empty buildings meant shelter without people. But then the rancher had appeared at dawn, and all Ruth's careful planning had shattered. Now they were trapped by their own exhaustion, too weak to run, too desperate to stay. Caught between the devil they'd escaped and the unknown this man represented. Silas appeared at the barn door in the afternoon, setting down more food and fresh water. He spoke through the wood again, asking if they needed anything else. Blankets, maybe? Medicine. Ruth's voice cracked when she finally answered, Why? Why are you helping us? The question hung in the air like smoke. Silas was quiet for a long moment before he responded. Because you need help. Ruth almost laughed. It couldn't be that simple. Nothing was ever that simple. Men didn't just give. They traded. They bargained. They took payment in flesh when coin wasn't available. But Silas just walked away again, left them with food and water and questions that burned worse than hunger. Ruth stared at the closed door, her mind spinning. This was wrong. All wrong. Either he was playing a longer game than she understood, or something impossible was happening and she didn't know which option terrified her more. Outside, Toby watched Silas return from the barn, asked if the women had said anything useful yet, where they came from, who held them, how many men might be tracking them. Silas shook his head. They weren't ready to talk. Toby's expression hardened. Then we might not have much time to prepare, because those tracks he'd noticed coming in, they weren't just from 5 women on foot. There were horse prints, too, distant but deliberate, circling the property like wolves testing a fence. Someone was already watching the ranch. The riders appeared on the ridge at sunset. 3 of them, silhouettes against the dying light, sitting motionless on their horses like statues carved from shadow. They made no move to approach, just watched. Toby counted them from the window, rifle already in his hands. 3 visible meant at least 2 more, hidden somewhere. That's how these things worked. Never show your full numbers until you're ready to strike. Silas joined him at the window, his face unreadable. They weren't Apache. The way they sat their horses, the shape of their hats. These were white men. Traders, maybe, or worse. In the barn, Ruth saw them too through a gap in the wooden wall. Her blood turned to ice. She recognized the lead rider's posture, even at this distance. Recognized the way he held his head tilted slightly to the left, a habit formed from an old injury that had never healed right. His name was Dalton Cross. He was the man who bought her from the Apache 6 years ago, the man who'd kept her in a canvas tent at his trading post, the man who'd rented her and the others to anyone with coin or goods to trade. And he'd come to take back his property. She turned to the other women, her voice barely a whisper. Wake up. They need to wake up now. Margaret's eyes opened first. Immediately alert, immediately afraid, she saw Ruth's expression and knew. Clara began to cry before she was fully conscious, a learned response to any sudden wake-up call. Sarah and Eliza simply stared, their faces empty of everything except resignation. This was it. The brief illusion of safety was over. Time to pay for the water and food, and rest they'd stolen from fate. Ruth's mind raced through options. The barn had a back door, small and half-rotted, but it might hold long enough for them to slip out. Then what? Run into the open grassland where horses would catch them. In minutes, hide in the house, and hope the rancher would fight for them. Why would he? He didn't know them. Didn't owe them anything. More likely, He'd hand them over the moment things turned violent, protecting his own skin like any sensible man would. But then, Silas appeared at the barn door. He didn't come inside, just spoke through the wood. Like before, told the men were watching the ranch. Asked if they knew who it might be. Ruth's voice shook when she answered. A trader named Dalton Cross. He's the one who kept us. He'll want us back. Silas absorbed this information with a calmness that seemed impossible given the situation. Then he said something that made Ruth's heart stop. He's not taking you anywhere. You're under my protection now. Ruth stared at the closed door. Protection? The word felt foreign in her mouth. Men didn't protect women like her. Men used women like her. That was the natural order of things out here where law meant nothing and strength meant everything. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. But belief had been beaten out of her over 6 years of learned lessons. Belief got you hurt worse when it proved false. Toby stood beside Silas on the porch as darkness fell. 3 riders had become 5. They'd moved closer, just barely within shouting distance, but still hadn't approached. Playing a waiting game, testing resolve, Toby asked what Silas planned to do if they rushed the property. Fight 5 men, maybe more hidden in the dark for women they'd found in their barn that morning. Silas checked his rifle. His movements practiced and smooth. Said he'd done harder things for worse reasons. Toby shook his head but didn't argue. He'd follow Silas into whatever came next. That's what loyalty meant out here. One of the riders finally moved forward, stopped 50 feet from the porch. His voice carried across the space between them. Friendly and reasonable, said he was looking for some property that had wandered off. Property he'd paid good. Money for property he intended to retrieve. No hard feelings. He'd even pay a finder's fee if the rancher would. Be reasonable about this. Just bring out the women and everyone could go home without trouble. Silas stepped forward into the lamplight. His answer was simple and clear. The women weren't leaving. Not tonight. Not ever. Not while they were on his land and under his word. The rider's friendly tone evaporated. He informed Silas that interfering with a man's property was a serious matter, could lead to serious consequences. Silas raised his rifle, just enough to be noticeable. Said he understood consequences just fine. The rider stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and retreated to where the others waited on the ridge. They gathered close, clearly arguing about the next move. Inside the barn, Ruth pressed her face against the wall gap, watching the confrontation end. Without violence, her hands trembled uncontrollably. He'd refused. He'd actually refused. Told him no. Stood between her and Dalton Cross like she was worth protecting. Something cracked inside her chest, not breaking, the opposite. Something frozen and dead beginning to thaw after 6 years of ice. And it hurt worse than any blow she'd ever taken because hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself to feel. On the ridge, Dalton Cross made his decision. If the rancher wanted trouble, trouble would arrive with the dawn. The night stretched like wire pulled too tight. Silas and Toby took turns watching from different windows, tracking the distant campfire where Dalton's men waited for dawn. Neither spoke much. There wasn't much to say. 5 armed men against 2 meant the numbers were bad. The fact that those 5 men felt entitled to the women meant the law wouldn't care who won. Out here, ownership mattered more than humanity. Possession was 9/10 enough. Everything. Ruth couldn't stay in the barn anymore. The walls felt like a cage. She needed to understand what was happening, what this man thought he could accomplish against Dalton Cross and his traders. She pushed open the barn door and walked toward the house, each step an act of will over terror. The other women called after her softly, begging her not to go, but Ruth kept moving. If she was going to die tomorrow, she wanted to die knowing why. A stranger had chosen to die for her. Silas heard her approach and turned from the window. Didn't raise his rifle. Didn't tell her to go back. Just watched her climb the porch steps with that same careful stillness he'd shown since the beginning. Ruth stopped at the bottom step, unable to make herself go higher. Old habits, learned positions. Never rise above a man unless he gives explicit permission. Never approach without invitation. Never assume access. He told her she could come up, sit if she wanted. Ruth's legs nearly gave out, not from exhaustion this time, but from the simple shock of being offered a choice. She climbed the remaining steps and lowered herself against the porch post, keeping maximum distance between them. Silas returned his attention to the campfire on the ridge. They sat in silence for several minutes before Ruth found her voice, asked him why he was doing this, what he expected to gain. Silas was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. Told her about a woman named Catherine, his wife, 15 years back. They'd been traveling to a new territory when raiders hit their wagon. He'd been thrown from the wagon early, knocked unconscious by a rifle blow. When he came to, Catherine was gone. He tracked them for 3 weeks before finding her. By then, she wasn't the same person anymore. Something vital had been destroyed inside her. She lived another year, but never really came back from wherever those men had sent her mind. Ruth absorbed this information, understanding blooming painfully in her chest. He knew. He actually knew what they'd been through. Knew what it looked like when a person's humanity got ripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but survival instinct and learned compliance. That's why he kept his distance. Why he didn't touch. Why? He spoke through doors instead of entering. He understood that proximity to men, any men, even helpful ones, triggered responses they couldn't control. She asked what happened to Catherine. Silas's jaw tightened. Said she took her own life one morning while he was checking the herd. Hung herself in the barn using rope he'd left. Accessible because he'd thought the worst was over. Thought she was healing. He'd found her an hour later, buried her, on the ridge where the sunrise hit first every morning. Catherine had been beautiful once, full of light and laughter. By the end, those things had been hollowed out of her. That's when he'd moved out here, far from people, far from the chance of failing someone again. Ruth felt tears burning in her eyes for the first time in 6 years. Not for herself, for him, for Catherine, for the impossible weight of trying to fix someone who'd been too thoroughly broken. She asked why he'd risk himself for them if his wife's story ended that way, if saving someone was even possible. Silas met her eyes directly, said maybe it wasn't. Maybe they'd all die tomorrow and it wouldn't matter. But the alternative was watching Dalton take them and doing nothing. And he'd done nothing once before while Catherine suffered. He wouldn't do it again. Something inside Ruth's chest cracked. Wider. This man wasn't playing a game. Wasn't working an angle. He was genuinely prepared to die, preventing her from being dragged back into hell. Not because he wanted something from her, but because he believed she was worth dying for. The concept was so foreign to her experience that her mind couldn't properly process it. Worth dying for. She hadn't been worth keeping alive to most men. Certainly hadn't been worth protecting. Toby's voice called from inside. Movement on the ridge. The campfire was being extinguished. Dalton's men were preparing to move. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but they decided not to wait. The element of surprise was worth more than tradition. Silas stood, checking his rifle one more time, told Ruth to get the others and take them to the root cellar beneath the house. There was a hidden door in the kitchen floor. They'd be safer there. Ruth stood too, her whole body shaking. Not from fear this time, from something she couldn't name. Gratitude felt too small a word. Devotion too large. Something between those extremes. She opened her mouth to thank him, to say anything that might capture what she felt, but no words came. Silas just nodded like he understood anyway. Then, He turned to face the darkness where Dalton's men were coming, and Ruth realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she would rather die here beside this man than live another day as Dalton's property. Ruth refused to hide, told the others to go to the cellar, but she stayed above ground, watching through the kitchen window as shapes materialized from the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret tried to pull her down, whispering desperate pleas, but Ruth shook her off. If Silas was going to die defending her, the least she could do was witness it, bear the weight of what his sacrifice cost. She owed him that much. Dalton Cross rode up slowly, his men spread in a loose line behind him. They stopped 20 feet from the porch where Silas and Toby stood with rifles ready. The trader wore the same expression he always did when conducting business. Reasonable, patient, a man who negotiated hundreds of transactions and knew how these things ended. He addressed Silas like they were discussing cattle instead of human lives. Said he appreciated the hospitality the rancher had shown his property, but the time for charity had passed. The women belonged to him legally. He had bills of sale, had witnesses who'd confirm the transactions. Any judge within 3 territories would rule in his favor. Fighting was pointless, messy, bad for everyone involved. Just bring out the women and accept the finder's fee. $200 for the trouble. More than fair. Silas's response was quiet, but carried like thunder. The women weren't property, weren't leaving. Dalton could turn around, or he could try to take them by force. Either way, he wasn't getting past this porch while Silas still breathed. The trader's reasonable expression cracked slightly. He reminded Silas that 5 guns beat 2. That being noble and being dead amounted to the same thing. That Catherine had taught him nothing useful if he thought one man could stop the inevitable. The mention of Catherine's name made Silas's finger tighten on the trigger, but he held steady. Inside the kitchen, Ruth's breath caught. Dalton knew about Catherine, had probably known her when she'd been taken, might have even been involved in the trade that sold her. The casual way he invoked her name, like she was just another commodity he'd once brokered, made Ruth's vision blur with rage. Dalton shifted tactics, offered to take only Ruth and Margaret, leave the younger ones as a gesture of goodwill. They were damaged goods anyway, harder to rent out, not worth the blood it would cost to retrieve them. Silas didn't even acknowledge the offer, just stood there, immovable, his rifle aimed center mass at the trader. The standoff stretched. One of Dalton's men got nervous, his horse dancing sideways. Another cleared his throat, clearly reconsidering the wisdom of dying over merchandise. Dalton sensed his advantage, slipping, and made his final play. Told Silas that men who interfered in business sometimes had accidents. Barns caught fire. Wells got poisoned. People disappeared on empty roads. Even if Silas won today, the war would continue until he lost. Ruth couldn't stay silent anymore. She pushed open the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch beside Silas, ignoring his sharp command to get back inside. She looked directly at Dalton for the first time in 6 years, without lowering her eyes, without bowing her head, without making herself smaller. Her voice shook but held. Told him he could kill them all, but he'd never own her again. Never touch her, never sell her. She'd rather bleed out in this dirt than spend another hour as his property. Dalton's face twisted. The reasonable mass dropped completely. He spurred his horse forward 2 steps, raising his rifle. But before he could aim, Silas moved, stepped directly in front of Ruth, putting his body between her and the weapon. Didn't point his own rifle at Dalton, just stood there making the message absolutely clear. To get to her, they'd have to go through him first, and he wouldn't go down easy. The moment crystallized. Ruth stared at Silas's back at the way he'd positioned himself as a human shield without hesitation. No calculation, no negotiation, just immediate instinctive Protection. The kind of protection that expected nothing in return. The kind that didn't require her to earn it or pay for it or be grateful enough to justify it. He simply believed she was worth defending, worth dying for, worth choosing over his own survival. Something broke inside her. Not the breaking that 6 years of abuse had. Caused a different kind, the kind that happened when ice melted and blood started flowing again to frozen limbs. And the pain of returning sensation was worse than numbness had ever been. She made a sound she didn't recognize. Half. Sob, half gasp. Her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees on the porch. Behind her, the kitchen door burst open. Clara, Margaret, Sarah, and Eliza had heard everything. They saw Ruth kneeling, saw Silas standing shield between them and Dalton, saw a man choosing them over his own life. Clara's face crumpled. Margaret's hands flew, too. Her mouth. Even Eliza, who hadn't made a sound in months, released a broken noise. That might have been a cry. And Dalton Cross, watching 5 women break down in tears on the porch of a rancher who refused to sell them, finally understood he'd already lost. Dalton stared at the scene before him. 5 women sobbing on a porch, a rancher standing between them and death like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time in 20 years of trading human lives, he felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut. Not conscience. He'd killed that long ago, but recognition. Recognition that this wasn't a negotiation he could win. His men felt it too. One of them lowered his rifle. Slightly. Another shifted in his saddle, eyes darting toward the horizon like he was already planning his escape route. They'd signed up to retrieve merchandise, not fight a war over broken women who'd become more trouble than profit. Dalton could see the calculation in their faces. Was the money worth dying for? The answer was spreading like disease through his group. He made one final attempt, told Silas he was making a mistake, that those women would never be right again, that saving them was like saving wounded animals too far gone to heal. They drain his resources, bring trouble to his door, and eventually leave or die anyway. He was throwing his life away for nothing. Silas's response was delivered with absolute certainty. If that's how it ended, at least he'd know he tried. That was worth more than whatever Dalton valued. The trader's jaw worked silently. He'd lost, and he knew it. But pride demanded some final gesture. He pointed at Ruth, still kneeling on the porch, tears streaming down her face. Told her she was making a choice she'd regret, that the world out here didn't forgive women like her, that without his protection, she'd end up dead in a ditch somewhere or worse. Ruth lifted her head, meeting his eyes with something he'd never seen in her before. Defiance mixed with absolute certainty. She told him she'd rather die free than live one more day as property. That, whatever happened next, even if it was painful, even if it was short, it would be hers. Her choice, her life, not his. Inventory, not his merchandise, hers. The word came out like a declaration of va mine. Dalton's face darkened, but he had nothing left to bargain with. The women had chosen, the rancher had chosen, and his own men were already backing their horses away. He turned his horse with deliberate slowness, preserving what dignity he could. Told Silas this wasn't finished, that men with long memories had ways of settling debts. Then he rode away, his men following with visible relief. They disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, and the only sound left was the sobbing of 5 women who'd just discovered they were human again. Silas lowered his rifle slowly, every muscle in his body tight with exhaustion and adrenaline. Toby exhaled loudly from the doorway, his own weapon shaking in his hands. They'd won somehow against odds that should have buried them. Ruth tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She remained kneeling, hands pressed, flat against the porch wood, her whole body convulsing with sobs she couldn't control. Clara crawled to her, rapping. thin arms around Ruth's shoulders. Margaret joined them, then Sarah, then even Eliza. They collapsed together in a heap of trembling limbs and tears and sounds that were half pain, half release. Silas watched them but didn't approach. Knew they needed this moment without male presence. Needed to feel each other's humanity without the weight of observation. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the corral where his horses stood nervously from all the commotion. Toby followed, giving the women space. They stood in silence, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and red. Toby finally spoke, voice rough, asked what happened. Now, how long before Dalton came back with more men? Silas admitted he didn't know. Maybe days, maybe never. Dalton had lost face in front of his crew. That might be enough to make him cut his losses. But even if Dalton returned, something fundamental had shifted. Those women had seen a man choose them over profit, over safety, over everything. That couldn't be taken back. Whatever healing they managed from here, whatever lives they rebuilt, they'd do it knowing they were worth defending, worth dying for, worth being human for. Behind them, the sobbing gradually quieted, not stopped, just transformed. The desperate edge faded, replaced by something that sounded almost like grief. Grief for the years lost. Grief for the selves they'd been before. But underneath the grief, something else, something that might, with time and care, become hope. Ruth lifted her head, looking at Silas's distant back. She whispered something the others couldn't hear. 2 words that changed everything. Thank you. The days that followed moved slowly, like the land itself was holding its breath. Silas kept his distance, maintaining the same respectful space he'd established from the beginning. The women stayed in the barn initially, but gradually ventured out as their bodies recovered from exhaustion and malnutrition. Ruth watched Silas constantly, studying him like he was a puzzle she needed to solve. Every action that didn't involve touching them, controlling them, or demanding from them reinforced something she'd thought was impossible. On the 3rd morning, Margaret approached Silas while he worked repairing a fence section. She stood 10 feet away, respecting the boundary he'd created, asked if he needed help with anything around the property. Her voice shook, and she kept her eyes on the ground, old habits dying hard. Silas paused his work, considering. Then he pointed to a section of fence that needed new posts. Said if she wanted, she could help Toby measure the distances. No obligation, only if it felt right. Margaret nodded slowly and walked toward where Toby worked. It was the first time she'd chosen to approach a man since her capture 4 years ago. The first time it had been her decision instead of a command. She trembled the entire time, but she did it. And when Toby handed her the measuring rope without comment, treating her like a person capable of simple work, something loosened in her chest. Claire started speaking again. Not much, just small sentences here and there. Comments about the weather, questions about the horses. She'd been silent, except for crying since the confrontation, but slowly words returned. Silas never pushed for conversation, never demanded responses. He simply answered when she spoke and left silence when she didn't. The lack of pressure made speaking easier, made existing easier. Sarah began eating normally instead of hoarding food. For weeks, she'd hidden pieces of bread in her clothes, terrified it would be taken away. But watching Silas prepare meals and leave them available without restriction, without cost, without expectation, taught her that food wasn't currency anymore. She could eat when hungry and trust there would be more later. The concept felt revolutionary. Eliza remained silent, but her eyes changed. The emptiness faded, replaced by watchfulness. She followed Ruth everywhere, staying close, but no longer clinging in terror. She watched Silas work from a distance, observing how he moved, how he spoke, how he existed in space without threatening anyone in it. She was learning, Ruth realized, learning what men could be when they chose humanity over power. Ruth herself struggled the most. Her walls had been built thickest and strongest. 6 years of survival through numbness and dissociation couldn't be undone in days. She still flinched when Silas moved too quickly, still calculated escape routes from every room, still waited for the moment when his patience would crack and his true intentions would emerge. But that moment never came. Days passed, then a week, and Silas remained exactly what he'd presented himself as from the beginning. One evening, Ruth found Silas sitting on the ridge where he'd buried Catherine. She approached slowly, announcing herself from a distance so she wouldn't startle him. He acknowledged her with a nod, but didn't speak. She sat down several feet away, both of them looking out over the grassland as darkness crept across the horizon. The silence stretched comfortably. Finally, Ruth spoke, asked him why he'd really done it, risked everything for strangers. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted he didn't have a good answer. Said maybe it was guilt over Catherine. Maybe it was knowing what happened to women out here and being tired of pretending he couldn't do anything about it. Maybe it was just seeing 5 people who needed help and having the means to provide it. Maybe reasons didn't matter as much as actions. Ruth absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. The weeks of rest and safety had begun to show on all of them. The haunted hollowness was gradually being replaced by something closer to the women they'd been before. Ruth's striking features were no longer hidden under layers of trauma and dirt. Clara's youthful beauty was returning with proper food and sleep. Even Margaret carried herself with a grace that years of captivity hadn't completely destroyed. Then Ruth did something she hadn't done voluntarily in 6 years. She smiled, small and fragile, and barely there. But Real told him that whatever his reasons, he'd given them something no one else had. A choice. The ability to decide for themselves what came next. That was worth more than safety or food or shelter. That was worth everything. Silas met her eyes directly for the first time since they'd met. Saw the person she'd been before, still buried, but fighting to resurface. Saw strength that 6 years hadn't completely destroyed. Saw someone choosing to live instead of just survive. He told her that whatever she and the others decided to do, whether stay or leave, they'd always be welcome here. This land had room enough for people learning how to be human again. Ruth's smile widened slightly, said she thought they might stay a while, learn how to exist without fear, relearn their names and who they'd been before men like Dalton Cross had tried to erase them. Silas nodded, said he'd like that. Then they sat together in comfortable silence. 2 broken people watching the stars emerge, beginning the long work of healing. 3 months passed like water, finding new paths through old stone. The ranch transformed as 5 women learned what it meant to choose their own movements, their own words, their own futures. Margaret took charge of the vegetable garden, coaxing life from soil with patience she'd forgotten she possessed. Clara worked with the horses, discovering they responded to gentleness better than force, a lesson that applied to more than animals. Sarah learned to cook, measuring ingredients, and making decisions about meals without asking permission first. Ruth became something unexpected, not a victim, learning to survive, but a leader rediscovering her strength. She organized the work, settled disputes between the others, and managed the household account Silas handed over without hesitation. The scar on her jaw no longer looked like damage. It looked like evidence she'd survived. She wore it differently now. Eliza spoke for the first time on a morning when frost painted the grass silver. She was helping Toby mend his saddle when she simply said, "Thank you." 2 words, quiet and rusty from disuse, but clear. Toby nearly dropped his tools, called for the others. When they gathered, Eliza repeated it, looking at each of them in turn. Then she looked at Silas and said something more. You gave us back our voices. Silas nodded, unable to speak himself for a moment. Dalton Cross never returned. Word reached them through a traveling merchant that the trader had moved his operations south, taking his remaining men and inventory with him. Some said he'd lost too much face to stay in the territory. Others said he'd simply decided 5 women weren't worth the cost of retrieving them. Either way, the threat faded like morning mist. The women were free in every sense that mattered. On the morning that marked the first full season of their arrival, Ruth found Silas at Catherine's grave on the ridge. She'd come here often over the months, drawn by the story of a woman who'd been broken by men like Dalton, a woman Silas had loved enough to build his whole life around, preventing more suffering like hers. Ruth carried wild flowers she'd picked from the garden Margaret had grown, placed them on the grave marker gently. She told Silas that she thought Catherine would be proud of what he'd done, that saving 5 strangers wouldn't bring his wife back, but it honored her memory better than grief alone ever could. Silas's voice was rough when he responded, said Catherine had been strong once before they destroyed her. That seeing Ruth and the others reclaimed that strength felt like completing something that had been left unfinished. Ruth asked him if he regretted it, taking them in, risking everything for women he didn't know. Silas shook his head firmly, said it was the first thing he'd done in 15 years. That felt right. That waking up knowing they were safe and healing made every risk worthwhile. Ruth stepped closer, still maintaining the respectful distance they'd established, but closer than she'd ever stood before. Told him she wanted to stay permanently, that the others felt the same, that this place had become more than shelter. It had become home. Silas turned to look at her fully, saw a woman transformed, not the terrified, broken person who'd hidden in his barn months ago. Someone who'd walked through fire and come out forged, stronger. He extended his hand slowly, giving her time to refuse, offering, rather than demanding. Ruth looked at his outstretched hand. For 6 years, men's hands had meant pain, control, violation. But this hand offered partnership, respect, choice. She took it. The handshake lasted only seconds, but it sealed something important. An agreement between equals, a pact between survivors. When she released his hand, Ruth smiled fully for the second time since her captivity had ended. The first smile had been fragile and uncertain. This one was solid, unbreakable. Down at the ranch, the other women worked together, laughing at something Clara said. Real laughter that carried on the wind. They built something here that Dalton Cross and men like him could never understand. They'd built a place where broken people could choose to heal, where refusing to take was more powerful than any act of force, where 5 women learned they were worth defending, worth respecting, worth being human for. Silas watched them from the ridge, Ruth standing beside him. He'd lost Catherine to men who saw women as property. But by refusing to repeat their violence, by choosing protection over possession, he'd helped 5 other women remember they were people first. It didn't erase the past, didn't fix what was broken, but it proved something Catherine never got to see. That not all men were the same, that some chose differently. And that choice, simple as it seemed, changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and humanity collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like these. Your support means the world to us.